Good day. Today is Monday, 13th January 2025, and we've now had an interview with Donald Trump's National Security Advisor, Mike Waltz, who has confirmed that steps are, as he put it, underway to arrange a call, a conversation between Donald Trump and Vladimir Putin, and that he expects that conversation to take place over the course of the next few days or perhaps weeks. Now, I take this form of words, this expression, the next few days, to imply that Trump, at least, now wants the conversation to take place, presumably by phone, before he is inaugurated president on the 20th of January. I say that because there is still a week to go until that event, and the expression the next few days suggests perhaps a certain element of urgency. And I am going to make a guess, and this is pure guess now, that the main purpose of the call, other than to establish direct contact between the Russian president and the man who in a week's time will be the new American president, other than that purpose, the purpose of the call is to start opening up the lines of communication between the US and Russian governments. From the moment that Donald Trump is inaugurated on the 20th of January, I expect that there will be visits to Moscow, probably by the new envoy, the man that Trump has appointed as his peace envoy, General Kellogg. And I suspect quite plausibly, quite possibly, we will have visits to Moscow, advanced visits to Moscow by Trump's aides, by people like Mike Waltz, perhaps the future Secretary of State, Marco Rubio, who's to say. Of course, those meetings might not take place in Moscow. But anyway, contacts between the senior officials of the coming Trump administration and senior officials of the Russian government taking place either in Moscow or perhaps in Washington or in some other third-party location. And I expect also that the other purpose of the call between Putin and Trump will be an agreement for an actual physical meeting, a proper summit between the two men. There are lots of doubts and uncertainties as to the exact location, the venue of this summit. Switzerland is again offering itself as a possible host for the summit, but the Russians over the last few years have become very, very angry with Switzerland. They've said that they no longer consider Switzerland a neutral country. Switzerland has enforced sanctions, EU sanctions against Russia. It has imposed its own sanctions against Russia. It has interfered with Russians' accounts in Swiss banks. It has allowed Swiss weapons to be exported to Ukraine by third parties. It has talked about relaxing its own restrictions on exports of military equipment from Switzerland to Ukraine. The Russians have said, and with some cause, that they no longer consider Switzerland to be neutral, and that might mean that the venue of the summit will not be Switzerland. Robert Fico of Slovakia has offered Slovakia itself as a possible venue. Putin has said that that's an option. And of course, there's also the possibility that Hungary might be an alternative venue. But in order to reach these places, Putin's aircraft would have to overfly either Ukraine itself, which I cannot imagine that Putin would want to do, or it would have to travel through EU territory. And of course, as we know, the EU states, or at least most of them, are committed to enforcing the arrest warrant that the International Criminal Court has issued against Putin. So I'm going to make a guess. I think there will be a summit meeting, but that I do not think it will happen anywhere in Europe. Turkey is a possibility. Perhaps it could be somewhere else. Anyway, there we are. I think, as I said, we will see the first steps being made towards setting up a summit. Now, as to what all of this diplomatic activity can achieve, that remains a very, very good question. The Russians have been downplaying the prospects of a major improvement in relations between themselves and the United States over the course of the forthcoming Trump administration. The Russian newspaper Kommersant, whilst reporting the moves to set up a US-Russia summit, says that Russia remains cautious about the outlook for future interactions with the US president-elect. The caution stems not only from the ongoing confrontation in US-Russia relations, but also from past dealings with the Trump administration during 2017 to 2021. During that period, the US imposed numerous sanctions on Russia, withdrew from critical arms control agreements, and declared a new era of strategic competition with both Russia and China. Dmitry Suslov, Deputy Director of the Center for Comprehensive European and International Studies at the Higher School of Economics, told Kommersant that Trump's second term could present greater opportunities for implementing agreements with Russia. First, because there are no lingering accusations of so-called Russian interference in the US election or claims of collusion between the Kremlin and Trump's team. Now he is perceived as a legitimately elected president. Second, Trump's emerging team is expected to show more internal unity, unlike his first term, when some individuals actively undermined his foreign policy, including decisions related to Russia. Third, the Republicans control Congress for at least the next 2 years. But then Suslov went on to say that one should not expect any significant breakthroughs. He continues to be skeptical about the likelihood of Moscow and Washington reaching an agreement on Ukraine. The terms for resolving the Ukrainian conflict, this is a quote from Suslov, that Russia might find minimally acceptable would appear to the United States as a catastrophic defeat. Against this backdrop, any concession to Russia, such as on the crucial issue of Ukraine's demilitarization, would likely provoke hostility from both Republican and Democratic hawks, as well as US allies in Europe. That analysis, that the minimum that Russia can accept as in order to be satisfied, to consider that it has achieved its primary objectives in the Ukrainian crisis, that anything that the Russians are likely to accept would be seen as a catastrophic defeat in the United States. That identical point has been made by Alistair Crook in a recent article. The article by Alistair Crook, by the way, its title is "Can Trump Save America from Itself?" The specific provision is the notion that once Trump envoys have been initially to Moscow and gone away empty-handed, that Trump will sweep in to conclude a Ukraine deal does not reflect what Moscow has been endlessly highlighting. What is required is a big picture treaty-based deal that settles the security architecture and frontiers between heartland and the heartland and the rimland security interests. The heartland being, of course, Russia, the rimland being its external borders. Such a deal will be seen by many Americans as weakness, as conceding US leadership and greatness. Of course, it will be perceived that way because Trump would effectively be sealing America's defeat and repositioning the United States as one state amongst equals in a new concert of powers, i.e. in a multipolar world. It's a big ask. Can Trump do it? Swallow America's pride? And, well, Crook does explore possible ways that it could be done. But realistically, the chances that Trump, at the very start of his presidency, would agree to something on that kind of scale is doubtful. And if we're talking about a treaty-based agreement, it faces what I think is the insuperable problem that no such treaty, couched in the terms that the Russians are proposing, would pass ratification but through the Senate, the US Senate, where it would require a 2/3 majority. And the supporters of such a treaty, to say it straightforwardly, don't remotely come close to having such a majority in the Senate. In fact, I'm going to go further than this. I think if a treaty, along the lines, say, of the two treaties that the Russians proposed back in December 2021, if such a treaty were proposed to the Senate now, especially after the military defeat that is coming in Ukraine, with all of the terrible consequences on American pride and American self-esteem, and all of that has, I think that not only would there not be a 2/3 vote in support of such a treaty if it were presented to the Senate, I think you would struggle to find any senators who would support that treaty at all. That has to be the reality. I think that this is an impossible sell, even for someone like Donald Trump. And I cannot imagine that he's going to burn up political capital trying to do it. Just saying. Now, on this, for the moment, however, it must be said that the Russians remain essentially implacable. We've had further comments from Dmitry Medvedev, deputy chair of the Security Council, the highest political and decision-making body in Russia. Medvedev, of course, was previously Russia's president and prime minister. He is a close political ally of Putin's. He is the leader of the United Russia Party, the formal leader of the ruling party, of which, by the way, Putin, in theory, is not even a member, just saying. And Medvedev, of course, is somebody who undertakes important missions for Russia and for Putin. Just a few weeks ago, for example, he was in China, where he was having a meeting with President Xi Jinping. Anyway, Medvedev, who has established himself as a very, very visible hardliner in Russia, in the Kremlin, on all Ukraine-related matters, but who I think is used by the Kremlin, by Putin himself, as a vehicle to set out in blunt and very forceful language things that Putin himself will not allow himself to say, but about which he probably agrees. I've never come across a single instance, for the record, when Putin has come out and said that he doesn't agree with anything that Medvedev, with any particular thing that Medvedev has said since the start of the special military operation in February 2022. Anyway, Medvedev has now come out and he has again made absolutely clear that ceasefires, freezes, that kind of thing, that they are not remotely on the Russian agenda. Even partition of Ukraine, in the way that some people have been talking about, North and South Korea, West and East Germany, they're not on the agenda as far as the Russians are concerned either. And this is what Medvedev has said. He said that I would like to highlight the so-called German scenario, which has resurfaced on the agenda. It suggests that a fragmented Ukraine would resemble a kind of West Germany and East Germany, with the role of West Germany, of course, assigned to Bandera's Kiev, whilst that of East Germany to the Russian territories that have returned to their homeland. This scenario has emerged for obvious reasons, despite having no chance of success. The explanation is simple. It facilitates reconciling the leadership of the illegitimate Kiev regime with the most extreme elements in Ukraine. And Medvedev then went on to say that in a historical sense, the Germanic scenario of settlement is only feasible in terms of integrating the territories of Malorussia into Russia. The four regions, and notice he doesn't talk about the four regions, he uses this formulation, Malorussia. Now this is not Novorussia. It is not the four regions plus Odessa and Nikolaev and those sort of places. The four regions, Crimea and Ukraine's Black Sea coast. Malorussia was the official name during the period of the Tsarist Empire, not just the official name. It was the name that Russians of that period used to use to refer to Ukraine as a whole. Now, probably that does not include Western Ukraine, places like Galicia, which of course at that time, during the period of the 19th century, the Tsarist Empire, were outside that empire and were part of the Habsburg Empire instead. But use of the expression Malorussia, Little Russia, does appear to lay claim to the entirety of Ukrainian territory outside the western regions, including, by the way, Kiev. And it also, by the way, would be is in fact an extremely offensive term, deeply objected to by many Ukrainians who, for obvious reasons, don't like being called little Russians, as opposed to the big Russians, who are those gathered around Moscow and in Russia itself. But anyway, Medvedev uses sometimes very strong language. Maybe he's not actually thinking in quite these radical terms. But suffice to say that there is no hint here of any compromise from him. And I think it would be unwise to think that his views on these issues differ so much from those current in the Kremlin. For the record, there's just been a meeting of the Security Council in Moscow. It discussed other topics, or so we are told. Of course, we're never given full transcripts of the discussions or real details about the agenda. But the fact remains that Putin and Medvedev have participated in the same meeting within just the last few days. And there's no reason to think that Medvedev is not familiar with Putin's thinking And of course, Putin is familiar with Medvedev's. Just saying. So, it looks as if there's not really very much room for agreement, because what the Russians are demanding is more than Trump is prepared to offer or is in a position to give. And the Russians are making it fairly clear that they won't settle for anything less. So why conduct, why press forward with discussions at all? Well, the first point to make, and this is the absolutely essential one, the key one, is that even if the United States and Russia cannot agree about Ukraine, and it is unlikely that they can, at least for the moment, they have nonetheless a huge number of other topics that they need to discuss as well. I've discussed in recent programs, for example, how on the 17th of January, Russia and Iran are on the brink of signing a partnership agreement with each other. This will include, apparently, the setting up of a free trade zone, the establishment of, the joining of the two countries into bank messaging systems. It could also, in fact, it almost certainly will have a significant security dimension. There will no doubt be supplies by the Russians of advanced radars and air defense systems to Iran. There could be all kinds of other arrangements and things in the pipeline between Iran and Russia. Now, all of this is coming at a time when some people in the West, some people in the United States, some people in Israel are still lobbying for an attack by the United States and Israel on Iran. I discussed that in my program yesterday. It is also a time when, coming at a time when there are concerns being expressed about Iran perhaps restarting its nuclear weapons program. And there have been, as I've also discussed in earlier programs, some hints from Iran itself that some officials in Iran are considering that possibility. Now, the United States, finding itself in a confrontation with Iran, will therefore logically need to speak with and consult with Iran's biggest, most important superpower backer, which is Russia. If the United States imposes sanctions on Iran, will the Russians undercut them? What guarantee can the Russians give that Iran will not press ahead with developing nuclear weapons? Is that what the United States wants the Russians to do? What will the Russians want in return? Perhaps the Russians have already obtained guarantees from the Iranians that that isn't going to happen. It's important that the Americans and the Russians understand each other and know about what each intends as relationships like the one between Russia and Iran starts to form. The same applies to Russia's relations with North Korea. There's been a huge burgeoning of contacts between the North Koreans and the Russians. The United States ought to be asking the Russians, what is that all about? Are you really going to sit back and allow Kim Jong-un to build up North Korea's armed forces? What guarantee do you have, if you do, that he's not going to use those armed forces to conduct some kind of attack on South Korea? Maybe Kim Jong-un has no such plans. Maybe this sort of build-up is entirely defensive. But we need to talk about this. We need to talk about North Korea's nuclear program. We ought to get a sense of where all this is going. And what exactly is your current economic relationship with North Korea? Again, I can have radically different perspectives about this, about North Korea, about what the Russians should be doing, what the Americans should be doing. But in their mutual interest, they need to know what each is going to do. Then, of course, there's the situation between Russia and China. The Russians are very, very cagey and are usually very reluctant to discuss their relationship with China, with third parties. But it would be very understandable if the Trump people would want to press the Russians about this. You can't discuss Russia's relationship with China unless, of course, you speak to the Russians. Maybe the Russians will refuse to be drawn. But again, if you are the United States, you probably will want some lines of communication with the Russians in order to discuss this. Just saying. There's all kinds of other things that the United States might want to discuss with the Russians. Recently, a Russian official floated the possibility that the United States, over the next few months, might start making proposals for an international treaty which would declare a weapon system like the Oreshnik, in fact, specifically the Oreshnik, a prohibited weapon. After all, the Americans have no counter to the Oreshnik at the present time. It might be that the Americans want to broach that possibility with the Russians also, though in that case, I'm sure the Russians will say immediately a flat no. But if you want to discuss any type of arms control at any level, or at least any restraints in armaments, my own view is that treaties on strategic arms limitation or that kind of thing at the moment is simply not within the realm of the possible. Just saying. But if you want to discuss any of these things, you need to speak with the Russians. So it is getting this dialogue with the Russians restarted. That is the priority. And obviously, the Russians and the Americans will talk about Ukraine. But even if they cannot talk about Ukraine, it makes sense for both to continue to talk to each other. This relationship, just like the relationship between the United States and China, is too important for international stability and for global peace to be dispensed with. It has been shocking that it has been interrupted for 3 years. And it is, frankly, only due to extraordinary self-restraint by the Russians during this 3-year period in the face of unending provocations that things have not gone catastrophically wrong. Anyway, that's one thing. Now that does bring us, however, back to Ukraine. Now, Admiral Kirby, spokesman of Joe Biden's National Security Council, as I discussed in my program yesterday, is now saying that the Ukrainians are not ready for peace talks any more than the Russians are. As I discussed in my program yesterday, the Russians have in fact always said that they are ready to sit down and talk with the Ukrainians, though they have no real expectations that that will happen. And they've pointed out that Zelensky himself is not a legitimate interlocutor because there is a question mark over his political and constitutional status. And besides, he has issued a decree which appears to prohibit negotiations. So how can negotiations even take place? The Ukrainians, for their part, are taking a completely different line. From time to time, Zelensky gives the impression that he is prepared to engage the Russians in negotiations. But whenever he does so, it quickly becomes apparent that in substantive terms he is not. Always he falls back on absurd formulas like the need for a diplomatic solution, but one which does not involve negotiations. He talks about a peaceful settlement, but it always turns out that what that amounts to is expecting the Russians to capitulate and to agree to his so-called peace plan, which is basically a demand for Russia's unconditional capitulation and for its complete withdrawal of all its forces, not just from the territories in Donbass and Kharkiv region, and Zaporozhye and Kherson region, which Russia controls, but from Crimea as well, which of course is not going to happen, as Mike Waltz has just pointed out. So the Ukrainians are not even interested in negotiations at the moment. So if there are not going to be negotiations, I should say the Ukrainians, I must qualify that. There's just been an opinion poll which shows that at least 70% of the Ukrainians, according to this opinion poll, would want to see peace on the basis of a compromise settlement. But as we have repeatedly seen in Ukraine, it is not what the majority of people feel at any one particular point in time. Before 2008, a large majority of Ukrainians, for example, opposed Ukraine's NATO entry, and yet that is now a provision. Seeking NATO entry is now a provision in Ukraine's constitution. The political class in Kiev, the Ukrainian equivalent of the deep state, the various powerful ultra-nationalist groups in Ukraine, they remain adamantly opposed to any compromise peace with Russia. As to the disproportionate influence of the ultra-nationalist groups in Ukraine and the extraordinary, extreme positions that they hold, there's been, by the way, a fine article by the American scholar Gordon Hahn in which he discusses the perspectives of these people, which are frankly extremely alarming and very, very much not just in ideological terms, but in linguistic terms, very similar in language to the kind of things that used to be said and written in the 1930s and 1940s in Europe, just saying. Anyway, for a perspective of what these people are and what they're about, Gordon Hahn has written a wonderful piece about them and about the disproportionate power they exercise within Ukraine itself at this particular time. So, negotiations between the Russians and the Ukrainians, all but impossible. Negotiation, at least for the moment, negotiations, a deal of the kind that the Russians might be looking for, beyond Donald Trump's ability to agree. So where does all this leave? Where does this all leave Ukraine? I'm going to make a suggestion as to what might happen. And that is that I think that the United States, the Donald Trump administration, for perhaps 100 days, according to Kellogg, or 6 months, according to others, will go through the motions of trying to get some kind of negotiation between the Ukrainians and the Russians up and running. We might even have some meetings at some level between some Ukrainian officials and some Russian officials brokered by the Americans. None of that is guaranteed, and there is a strong possibility that this will all fall apart. But based on what Trump has been saying over the last week, and based also on Mike Waltz's own comments, I frankly get the feeling that without a ceasefire, with the Ukrainians steadily losing ground over this period, as prospects for a negotiated solution dim. At the end of this 100-day or 6-month period or whatever it is, the Americans will say that they've done what they can. It's now up to the Ukrainians themselves and up to the Europeans, and the United States, having invested massively in Ukraine, is no longer in a position to do any more. Trump has already written a strong letter to Zelensky, trying to get Zelensky to understand that Ukraine is not going to recover its lost territories. There was a tone of, I thought, genuine exasperation in that letter. Unless the Ukrainians change their stance radically over the next 100 days to 6 months, and as I said, Gordon Hahn sets out the reasons why that might not happen, I think that the Americans will say, as I said, will be in a position to say that they've done what they can, and they will walk away. Now, at that point, it will come back to the Ukrainians, and it will also come back to the Europeans. Here, I do want to, however, turn to some further points that Mike Waltz made over the course of his interview. Firstly, he did say that it was the absence of contacts and communication between the Americans and the Russians that had caused this crisis in the first place. That is absolutely true. He did also, however, say that the Ukrainians do not have a stable situation on the battle fronts. They're losing ground all the time, but at the same time, they're endlessly, ceaselessly saying that the reason the reason they're fighting is not just to defend themselves, but to defend freedom and liberty and democracy and Western civilization and Europe itself from the Russians. And Waltz went on to say that if that is really true, then in order for the negotiations to have any prospect of success, what the Ukrainians need to do is to stabilize the front. And if they really believe that they're fighting for Western civilization in the way that they say, then really they can't go on saying that they're not going to conscript young men extending down all the age to 18. Now, I have to say, I still think that was a most inappropriate thing for Waltz to say. I do not think it is for any Western official or future official to tell the Ukrainians, in effect, to mobilize young men of 18 and upwards. And furthermore, I think that this is a terrible idea anyway and should not be broached by anyone. And I've expressed my reasons why at many times. And broaching it does, to some extent at least, align Waltz with what the Biden administration and others like Wallace, the former British Defence Secretary, and others have also been saying. They have been urging and in effect bullying the Ukrainians to do this very thing, to reduce the conscription age to 18. However, there was a nuance in Waltz's words which did make it slightly different. And I want to stress again, it's not that I approve or agree in any way with what Waltz said, but there is a certain difference, because the way that Waltz said it, it did seem to me to provide a kind of escape clause intended to provide the Trump administration with a kind of escape clause. It's basically saying to the Ukrainians, look, you say all of these things, you say that you're fighting for civilization and all of that. You're describing the war in this incredibly existential language. And yet, you're not acting as if you really believe that. You're not throwing everything you have into winning this war in that way. So if you are not prepared to do that, then you cannot expect us in Washington to take this war in quite as seriously as you demand that we should. Now that might be reading more into what Waltz said than he intended. I don't know. But it did seem to me that the way Waltz said that gave further grounds to think that at the back of his mind and at the back of the minds of the Trump people, they're already preparing to walk away. Not to negotiate a deal with the Russians, mind, but just to walk away. Now that throws it all back to the Ukrainians and to the Europeans. And there's been lots of brave talk from Europe, from people like Kaja Kallas and others, that the Europeans can't pick up the slack. Now, there's been a series of very brilliant articles about US-Russia relations and about the situation between the state of the war between Russia and between Russia and Ukraine by the former Indian diplomat M.K. Badrakuma on his indispensable blog, India Punchline. And he points out how very surreal in some respects the war in Ukraine has now become. Badrakuma also, by the way, has a very interesting piece about Trump's spheres of influence proposals, which he describes as the US seeking to create a greater America. Just saying. But the article I want to home in on is one that Badrakuma has linked to, which has been published, written rather, by a associate fellow at Chatham House, and I believe it is actually published by Chatham House, Samantha de Burden. Chatham House is, of course, the most prestigious think tank and debating place on international affairs matters in Britain, and one of the oldest and most prestigious in the world, though I have many issues with them, but that's another story. Anyway, Samantha de Bender says, Europe cannot fill void left by the United States in Ukraine's defense. Europe's struggle to replace US military aid to Ukraine highlights deep political and industrial challenges that leave the continent vulnerable to Russian aggression. And she makes the point that the war has highlighted the reality that Europe's defense industries, its defense procurement practices, the state of its armed forces are a complete mess. Of course, if you've been listening to Brian Beletic at the new Atlas, if you've been following our programs on the Duran, if you've been following what I've been saying on this channel, that would not come as any sort of news to you. But anyway, this is now being confirmed by an associate fellow at Chatham House. And I'm going to say that things are actually worse than Samantha de Burden admits, because if we actually look at the situation in Europe, well, the Europeans have thrown quite a lot of money at their defense industries over the last 3 years, but they have really very little to show for that. And this does indeed reflect structural problems in European industries, defense-related industries. But the reality is that Europe is in the throes of a deepening economic crisis. Germany is going through a process of deindustrialization, as I and many others now have discussed. I think on the Duran, we were the first people to say, back in February 2022, that Germany was now looking at deindustrialization. Just so. We've had similar problems across Europe. There's a budgetary crisis in France. There's a budgetary crisis in Britain. Britain is now facing problems in the international bond markets. There is no realistic way that any of these countries are going to be able to increase defense spending in any serious way over the next 5 or 10 years. I think that fact has to be understood and has to be faced. If we're talking about the situation in Britain today, there is an ongoing political and economic crisis in Britain. Bond prices, yields on British bonds, gilts, are growing because the international markets are becoming increasingly sceptical that the British government is going to be able to cover its borrowing costs. So they are charging more for lending to Britain every day. There is a big hole in the British budget. The British government recently increased taxes on business to try to cover part of this hole, but then it also had to increase borrowing as well, borrowing more and taxing more than the previous Conservative government, falsely, by the way, said it would do. Now, sooner or later, at some point or rather, many expect that something will have to give. And the assumption is, and this is in the media in Britain today, especially as Britain appears to be perhaps already in recession. Anyway, the assumption is that the British government, is going to have to cut spending. Now, if it cuts spending, where is it going to cut spending? It's not going to cut spending, or at least it's going to be very careful about cutting spending on the health service, on the education system, on social welfare. The previous Conservative government was severely criticised for leaving all of these services in Britain, badly underfunded. This is a Labour government. It is committed to keeping these services funded. That is why people still vote for it. So they're going to have great trouble cutting social spending, welfare spending, health spending, education spending. That's not to say that they might not do so. They might find that the economic and financial pressures are too great and they have no choice. But it's not what they're going to want to do. And if they do it, they will pay a terrible political price. It's doubtful, to say it frankly, that Prime Minister Starmer will remain Prime Minister if it happens. And already there's question marks about the future of Rachel Reeves, the British Finance Minister or Chancellor of the Exchequer. Today, before I made this video, I've been reading an article in The Guardian which says that Prime Minister Starmer has said that Rachel Reeves has his full backing. Now, if anybody familiar with British domestic politics, knows that when the Prime Minister says that a particular minister has the Prime Minister's full backing, it is a sign that that minister is in very, very serious trouble and likely to lose his or her job very soon. Just saying. So, given all of these pressures, how realistically likely is it that the British government is going to be able to increase defence spending? I would have said it was politically impossible. In fact, I would go further and I would say that if the British government is indeed forced into spending cuts, one of the places that they're likely to cut spending is on the defence budget. Just saying. And the same is going to happen pretty much everywhere else. France is currently running a budget deficit in excess of 6% of GDP. The previous Prime Minister, Michel Barnier, proposed a budget intended to try and bring this deficit down to 5% of GDP, which, as several people have pointed out, already exceeds the Maastricht rules, which are supposed to be obligatory on members of the Eurozone, such as France. That budget was unacceptable and was voted down by the French Parliament, and Barnier was forced to step down. His successor, Monsieur Bayrou, is apparently intending to propose an almost identical budget to the French Parliament, which looks like it's going to be rejected all over again. It seems that the attempts to win over middle-of-the-road socialist deputies in the French National Assembly to support Monsieur Bayrou's new cabinet is going to fail. So we have a major budgetary and political crisis in France. It's very difficult to see how this problem can be resolved without new elections. And is it realistic to suppose, going into those elections, that the right-wing party, the Rassemblement National, Marine Le Pen's party, or the various parties that make up the left coalition are going to commit themselves to even steeper budget cuts so that defence spending can grow? In Germany, there's also elections coming. There's more leeway, perhaps, to increase spending in Germany. But, as we'll discuss shortly, it's looking increasingly unlikely that German opinion really will want to increase defence spending to support Ukraine. Because even if defence spending in Europe is increased, that spending logically should be dedicated to increasing defence inventories. Donald Trump has recently been hinting, probably this shouldn't be taken too seriously, about an American annexation of Greenland. Germany, France, and other European countries are saying that this is absolutely unacceptable, that if the United States takes action against Greenland, then the European provisions, new European provisions for mutual defence within the European Union kick in, and France and Germany and all of the other countries will resist this action by the United States in Greenland. By the way, and in parentheses, France and Germany saying that further buries the theory promoted even by people like Putin that the European Union is simply an economic bloc. Others in Russia, like Medvedev and Lavrov, have been saying that the European Union is actually a geopolitical bloc with an increasing security dimension. The latest statements about Greenland by the French and the Germans appear to confirm that, and that is not going to be ignored in Moscow, and it might have an effect on any future discussions about the Russians continuing to support Ukraine's bid for membership of the EU. Just saying. But anyway, let's go back to what the French and the Germans are saying about resisting the Americans on behalf of Denmark in Greenland. It is completely absurd. It is absurd at multiple levels. Were such a thing to be done, it would of course be the end of NATO. And as I've discussed in many programs, as Alex Christoforou and I have also discussed in many programs, a situation where there was a military confrontation between Germany and France and the United States leading to the collapse of NATO is the diametric opposite of what the Europeans want at the present time. They want to preserve NATO and they want to keep the United States in Europe. But put that all aside. In military terms, this is an absurd bluff. Let's start with Denmark. Apparently there's all of 75 soldiers, Danish soldiers, in Greenland at any one point in time. Maybe following these comments from Trump, the Danes have sent more troops to Greenland. But Denmark's army military only numbers about 16,000 men. I don't think anybody generally believes that they can reinforce much more. But the point is, the Danish military may number 16,000 men, but it's a disarmed military. The Danes have given apparently all their self-propelled artillery to Ukraine. They've given their F-16 fighter jets to Ukraine. They've given Ukraine huge amounts of weapons from their existing stockpiles. So have the Germans. So have the British. The French have done so to a lesser extent. But as I have discussed in previous programs, the British supposedly are down to 40 operational tanks. They too have given a disproportionate number of their self-propelled guns to Ukraine. They've also given Ukraine apparently most of their Storm Shadow missiles. What are they going to fight the Americans with if the Americans come for Greenland and the other European NATO states choose to resist them? There is no condition. The European armies are in no condition to fight the Americans at this present time, any more than they're in a position to fight the Russians. In fact, I read an article by someone, I think it was by Lee Schuster, but I'm not going to say definitely that it was by him, in which the article made the point that many European armies now have been reduced, in effect, to uniformed gendarmeries, sort of lightly equipped police, paramilitary agencies, certainly not remotely fit to engage in any sort of high-intensity modern war, either against the Americans or the Russians. So let us assume that the Europeans do manage to get their industrial issues in order. Let's assume that the Europeans do start producing more weapons and are prepared to spend more money doing so. Surely the logical thing to do would be to re-equip their armies first. Their armies logically should be taking priority at this time. If On the contrary, they go on sending whatever arms they produce and whatever arms they still have to Ukraine in order to keep the war going there. Then all that's going to happen is that the Europeans are going to be chasing a runaway train, and they will never be able to catch up. They will never produce enough weapons to rearm their armies, and they will never produce enough weapons to arm Ukraine. And all that will happen is that they will have to send more weapons to Ukraine from their existing stockpiles, which will deplete those stockpiles even further and make the military crisis in Europe still greater. Now, there is no simple way out of this problem. In theory, the Europeans could buy weapons from third parties. One obvious party would be the United States. But then the United States currently has inventory issues of its own. It too is not producing enough weapons to keep Ukraine supplied, to keep its own military supplied, and to confront China in the Pacific. Of course, extra money from Europe might make it easier for the United States to start production of weapons, to build more factories and things of that kind. But of course, all of that takes time, takes effort. It's going to be a prolonged operation. It's doubtful whether that can happen fast enough to help Ukraine, even if it happens at all. And in reality, in terms of given conditions of tight supply, placing big orders in the United States for more weapons to send to Ukraine, all that's going to do is it's going to inflate the price of weapons. And of course, after the Czech venture of trying to buy weapons for Ukraine on the international arms market, well, the Europeans were very, very badly stung by that, just as I said they would be. They should know that if they go to the international arms market and try and buy weapons there for Ukraine, they will not end up with many weapons, certainly not weapons in a usable condition. What they will end up with is a situation where they have spent an awful lot of money and achieved, in effect, nothing at all. So there is no way around this. If the United States feels that it is depleting its resources by supporting Ukraine, then given how depleted Europe's resources are, depleted even further by the war in Ukraine, there is no realistic way that the Europeans can step in and take over from the Americans. Now, logically, properly, the Europeans ought to understand this, and they ought to be coming to Zelensky and to the Ukrainians and explaining this all to them. The Ukrainians at times, sometimes, have shown brief glimmers of understanding that this is the case. But on the contrary, up to now, the entire effort in Europe has been to try to keep the war going by trying to keep the Americans still involved. There's been a sustained effort, as I've discussed in recent programs, to try to bring Trump round to go on doing this. And remarkably, there's still some evidence of this if you go to places like the Financial Times, for example. A recent article in which the Financial Times just covered Mike Waltz's interview, the one in which he confirmed that there's going to be talks now, actual contact between Putin and Trump. Well, the Financial Times did not lead on that, even though that is clearly the most important story. That is clearly the story relative to Walz's interview. They led instead on Walz's comments about Ukraine reducing the conscription age to 18, and said that the Trump administration is putting pressure on Ukraine to do that in a way that seemed to imply that the Trump administration is thinking like the Biden administration. Well, you can go on doing that. You can go on pretending to yourself that contacts between the Americans and the Russians are not about to happen. You can still persuade yourself that you might be able to talk Trump round. Perhaps you will succeed in all of these things, though even that ultimately is not going to resolve your problems, given that Ukraine is losing the war and will go on losing it, whatever you do. But my own view is that this kind of approach is an exercise in denialism about the shift in American policy that is underway, and I think it's simply going to result in the Europeans being even less prepared for what is coming than they ought to be, and is losing valuable time in the Europeans themselves explaining the situation to the Ukrainians. Anyway, there we are. That's, I think, where we are in this situation at the moment. Now, of course, much remains to be seen. Negotiations have a strange way of taking unexpected directions. It could be that if the Americans and the Russians talk to each other, they might be able to find a consensus over Ukraine. My own guess is that what might lend urgency to an agreement is not a stabilization at the front lines, which is not going to happen, but actually a Russian breakthrough. It may be that a moment will arrive when the Russians don't want to move further west, and the Americans, backed by their European friends, want to keep the Russians away from reaching Ukraine's western borders. And at that point, some kind of understanding between the West and Russia might be reached. But looking at things as they are at the moment, I think it is more likely, as I said, that we will have a resumption of active dialogue between the Americans and the Russians. But the big story is that the Americans are prepared to walk away from Ukraine. Now, I will now just say a few quick things about the situation on the front lines. In some respects, it is more of the same, but I would say that there are some reports today that the Ukrainian defense in Chasiv Yar has now fully collapsed, and that the Russians are in control, perhaps not of all of Chasiv Yar, but of all of the key positions. I understand that Ukrainian sources, for example, are now saying that the industrial area, the factory area, the area of the refractory plant in Chasiv Yar has now fully passed under Russian control, and that the Russians also control or have surrounded Ukrainian troops in the Novi micro-district, which very foolishly the Ukrainians recaptured, or rather walked into a trap over, only to find themselves surrounded there. So it looks as if Chasiv Yar, the Battle of Chasiv Yar, may be about to end. And as I discussed yesterday, I think the Battle of Toretsk has actually ended. I suspect that at some point over the next couple of days, perhaps before Trump's inauguration, we will have the Russian Defense Ministry confirm Russian control of Toretsk. We've also now got definite visual confirmation that the Russians have cut the main road between Pokrovsk and Konstantinovka, this great highway lying 3 kilometers north of this village of Vozdvizhenka that the Russians have captured. In fact, there's some very, very dramatic footage released by the Ukrainians showing Russian armoured vehicles located on the road itself, on a crossroads, in fact, or rather a road junction, and battling Ukrainian armoured vehicles there. There's clearly a fight. It's not clear how the fight ended, but most indications suggest that the road has indeed now been fully cut and that the Russians are in the process of storming a village called Yelizavetivka, which lies directly south of the road, closer to the road than Vozvyzhenka itself. The Russians today have announced that Pishanye, the village near Pokrovsk, northwest of Pokrovsk, has been fully captured by the Russians, and it seems that the Russians have advanced further west of Pokrovsk, and that they have indeed now reached the village of Kotlyevo, and that there is already fighting going on the outskirts of that village, and that the Russians have captured all the tree lines around this village, which it looks as if they're about to storm. And there continue to be reports that the Russians are in the process of storming Velika Novosilka. That battle is starting to resemble very closely the last days of Ugledar. And if we return to the situation around Kupiansk, some are saying that this is the most dangerous situation for the Ukrainians of all. Not only have the Russians established themselves with a large bridgehead now west of the Oskol River, north of Kupiansk, but it turns out that that village, which I thought that the Russians might have captured west of the Zherebets River, actually has the identical name. That's apparently we're dealing again with villages with identical names. The village that the Russians captured is again in this area. The bridgehead is now looking very large. It's likely that the Russians have established pontoon bridges in this area across the Oskol River. Probably over the next couple of days or weeks, we're going to see a major Russian offensive, taking Kupiansk and perhaps capturing other places west of the Oskol River as well. Just to get a sense of how dramatic events are becoming on the battlefields, yesterday the Russians, or at least reports from the battlefronts, confirmed that a village called Orekhovo-Vasilyevka, located north of Chasov Yar, had been captured by the Russians. Way back in 2023, when Prigozhin and Wagner Group were seeking to capture Bakhmut, the Russians reached the outskirts of that village, and there was lots of speculation about whether the Russians would move forward to capture that village, and the Ukrainians resisted fiercely to retain the village. And now apparently the Russians have just walked in and captured it against minimal resistance. So one gets the sense of the gradual collapse, the cascading collapse that continues to happen across the front lines. And to repeat again, it is this which is shaping the diplomatic calculus. If the Trump people have not understood that they're dealing with a losing war, I think Trump has, by the way. I think a few others, like perhaps J.D. Vance, have understood it as well. I think before long, they will all do so. And that will shape their diplomatic strategy. And given the capacity constraints, the impossibility of continuing to support Ukraine, that is going to make them more inclined to walk away, given that the United States cannot concede all of the various things that the Russians are asking. Anyway, I want to return briefly, before I finish this programme, to the situation in the Middle East. Firstly, I should say that Bashar al-Assad's former press spokesman has now given a most interesting interview, or has recently given a most interesting interview to, I believe it was a Saudi news outlet. In it, he alleged that Assad had in some way been tricked by Putin. This spokesman gave the first definite confirmation that I've seen that Assad was indeed in Moscow on the 28th of November and did indeed meet Putin then. There have been rumours to this effect. The Russians have never confirmed it. They've never provided a readout. But anyway, according to this story, Assad met Putin, asked Putin to continue to support Syria. This was at a time when the battle for Aleppo was just starting. Putin said yes. Putin also said that the Russians would indeed make Khmeimim Air Base available to the Iranians, for the Iranians to use in order to airlift their troops to Syria. And that Assad went away from this meeting convinced that he had the Russians backing him, only in reality the Russians, Putin, had quietly made a decision that Assad had become a liability rather than an asset and needed to be disposed of, so that these arrangements that Putin supposedly agreed to on the 28th of November were never put into effect. So this spokesman says that the Russians somehow tricked Assad. They made Assad think that he continued to have their backing. In fact, he didn't. And that was why Syria fell. I have to say, I understand the anger and bitterness of this man. But I don't think that the situation that he outlines actually corresponds with the conclusions that he himself draws from it. Firstly, what Putin is alleged to have said to Assad on the 28th of November corresponds exactly with the information I was receiving from my source at the time. And my source was obtaining his information from sources within Russia, just to say. Now, my source was saying that the Russians at that time were indeed fully committed to supporting Assad. They were intending to rush Wagner forces and special forces to Syria. That this is what Khmeimim Air Base was going to be used for. The Russian general was replaced with a more dynamic and active officer who would hopefully bring the whole situation under control. And at around that same time, as I remember, there were reports that the Iranians were doing everything they possibly could to try to arrange for forces, their own forces, to be sent to Syria to support Assad. The reason this all fell apart was not because the Russians tricked Assad, it was because the Syrian army collapsed. The collapse in Aleppo happened almost immediately after this meeting, and it became abundantly clear in the hours and days following that the Syrian army was simply not prepared to fight. And the result was that both the Russians and the Iranians quickly concluded that there was nothing that they could do to retrieve what was already a lost situation. And that is why they withdrew support. Now, Alistair Crooke, who knows the Middle East extremely well, has described the situation very well. And he's described Assad's extraordinary insouciance, his complacency as the situation escalated around him. Alistair Crooke has written a really fascinating article, Imperial Hubris and its Consequences in Syria. It discusses an awful lot about the mistakes that Erdogan is making and the problems that that is going to give rise to, and the fact that the Americans themselves have also probably taken on more problems in Syria than they understand. But in some ways it was what Crooke has to say about Assad that I found the most interesting, because it goes so far to explain Syria's collapse. And Crooke is, of course, an extremely well-informed person. He has access to information coming out of this region, which I don't know anyone else who has it to anything like the same degree. And the way he put it is this: Assad was not abandoned by his allies. He had basically placed excessive reliance on his Arab friends, first and foremost Egypt and the United Arab Emirates, who'd been urging him to break with Russia and Iran. Assad flip-flopped too much, that the Russians and the Iranians had warned Assad that his army as a whole was too fragile, too underpaid, and too penetrated and bribed by foreign intelligence services to be expected to defend the state effectively. I'm now quoting directly from the article. Assad also was warned repeatedly about the threat from Idlib, jihadists planning to take Aleppo, but he not only ignored the warnings, he rebutted them. He was offered a very large external military force, presumably that was from Iran, not once but twice, even in the last days as the jihadis were advancing, and refused. He said, "We are strong." He told an interlocutor on the first occasion. I'm guessing that interlocutor was Iranian, maybe Arakchi, the Iranian foreign minister, who, as I remember, visited Damascus and actually had a meeting with Assad. And yet, shortly afterwards, on a second occasion, he admitted, "My army is running away." And we're told that a Syrian who knew the Assad family, this is somebody I suspect that Crooke has spoken to. Crooke obviously is not going to give me details of his sources. A Syrian who knew the Assad family and who spoke with Assad at some length just prior to the Aleppo invasion found him surprisingly sanguine and unflustered, assuring his friend that there were enough forces in Aleppo to deal with the jihadi threats, and hinting that President Sisi, as the president of Egypt, might be ready to step in with aid to Syria, something which, of course, never happened. And the Crooke also publishes a piece by somebody called Ibrahim Al-Amin, editor of Al-Akhbar. I presume this is a Lebanese newspaper. And he says that Assad seemed to have become more confident that Abu Dhabi was capable of resolving his problems with the Americans and some Europeans, and he had heard a lot about economic temptations if he agreed to the strategy of exiting the alliance with Iran and Russia. One of Assad's workers who stayed with him until the last hours before Damascus says that Assad was still hoping for something big to happen to stop the armed factions' attack. He believed that the Arab and international community would prefer that he remain in power rather than allow the jihadists to take control of Syria. And it seems that there was also a very secretive aspect to Assad's departure from Syria. And we're also told that Assad himself, perhaps a lot of his energy and dynamism was lost as a result of the health problems of his wife. Now, this is all things that I've said before, but we can see here that others who actually knew Assad were noticing and talking about this. My own straightforward view about the collapse of Syria in November is that it was preventable, despite the imposition of the Caesar sanctions. The reason it happened is because Assad, tempted perhaps by offers of support from the Arab states and also demoralized by the illness of his wife, lost his way. In a region like the Middle East, that is absolutely fatal. His enemies, the Turks, the Israelis, the Americans, the British, the jihadis, they smell blood in the water. So, of course, did the various people who were supposed to be defending the Syrian state, the Syrian military commanders, the army officers, the generals, people like that. And the moment that happened, it all but guaranteed that Syria itself would collapse like a house of cards. So I just wanted to mention these things. I think that there are many myths about the causes of Syria's collapse. I can understand why someone still loyal to Assad, his press spokesman, wants to blame the Russians for what happened. But I think the explanations must be found, as Alistair Crooke says, to a great extent in his own decisions. Well, this is where I finish my programme today. There'll be more programmes from me shortly. Let me remind you again, you can find all our programmes on our various platforms, Locals, Rumble and X. You can support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar. Don't forget also to check out our shop, links under this video. And last but not least, if you've liked this video, please remember to tick the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. That's me for today. More from me soon. Have a very good day.